Your brain needs support, and new Ollie Brainy Chews are a delightful way to take care of your cognitive health. Made with scientifically backed ingredients like Thai ginger, L-theanine, and caffeine, Brainy Chews support healthy brain function and help you find your focus, stay chill, or get energized. Be kind to your mind and get these nootropic chews at ollie.com. That's OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
This podcast is sponsored by Cloud Optimizer.
As we migrated more of our business to the cloud, we were seeing expenses go up, but we couldn't pinpoint the cause. It seemed less of a cloud, more of a fog. That's why we brought on Cloud Optimizer, and they saved the day.
Are you seeing your cloud hosting bills go up and you're not sure why? It's time to put Cloud Optimizer to work for you. Cloud Optimizer analyzes usage patterns, right-sizes resources, leverages discounts you may not be aware of, implements automation, and much more. And by reducing unnecessary expenses and maximizing performance, Cloud Optimizer guarantees you a savings of 5 times what you spend for their service.
With Cloud Optimizer, we have our spend under control. Our company is more agile, profitable, and we're getting peak performance from our cloud.
Make the cloud work for you with Cloud Optimizer. Get a free assessment and find out how much you can save by going to cloudoptimizer.com. Go to cloudoptimizer.com for your free assessment. That's cloudoptimizer.com.
People are excited by doing the new ending and by the process of working on a new ending. They're excited to be doing something new, and I think all of us are always excited by the prospects of the unknown. And listen, like all new works, there are going to be people who love it, and there are going to be people who say, I can't stand it.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, Ronald Young Jr.
And I'm your other host, June Thomas.
June Thomas, it is wonderful to be chatting with you again. Tell me, whose voice did we hear at the top of the show?
That was Francesca Zambello, who is the artistic director of the Washington National Opera, and she's also a celebrated director of opera and theater.
And why did you want to talk to Francesca right now?
Well, the Washington National Opera is currently home to a new production of Turandot. Turandot is, of course, an opera by Giacomo Puccini with a libretto by Giuseppe Adami and Renata Simoni. It's hugely popular. It contains some of the most famous arias in opera, but it has certain elements that are unconvincing, misogynist, and with some uncomfortable Orientalist Asian stereotypes. One of the things about Turandot is that Puccini actually died before he'd finished writing the opera. And so the ending, the last 20 minutes or so, were kind of finished for him by someone else. So there's always been this feeling that it's not quite what Puccini would have created. So as we discuss in this interview, at Francesca's initiation, this production changes the resolution of the show and it removes some of the uncomfortable stereotypes. And I was really interested to learn more about what motivated her to set those changes in motion and how this new version came together. Okay,
that sounds interesting, intense, and like a lot is in there, which I'm really looking forward to hearing. But do you have anything special for our Slate Plus members? Anything extra?
Oh, you know I do. I asked Francesca if there were other plays or operas she would like to give a new ending to, and how her work at the Washington National Opera compared with the tasks she faced when she was the artistic and general director at Glimmerglass, a summer festival in upstate New York. I have to say, her answer was not what I was expecting.
Okay, I'm also looking forward to that. And if you're a member of Slate Plus, you'll hear that at the end of this episode. If you are not a Slate Plus member, it is really easy to join. As a member, you get to hear extra segments on this show and others like the Culture Gab Fest and Care and Feeding, the parenting podcast formerly known as Mom and Dad Are Fighting. You'll also get bonus episodes of podcasts like the Ambie Award-winning Slow Burn. And of course, you'll never hit a paywall on Slate.com. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus. All right, let's hear June's conversation with Francesca Zambello.
We've all been there. You have a question about your credit card. You call the number for help and can't get a hold of anyone. If only you had a Discover card. With 24/7 US-based live customer service from Discover, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, you heard that right, a real person. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. Francesca Zambello, welcome to Working. I am very excited to discuss your work as an opera director and especially the production of Turandot at the Washington National Opera, which you have commissioned and shaped. Welcome.
It's great to be here, June. Thank you.
So first, I'm curious for your take on the work of a director of opera. I know you've also directed musicals and plays, but opera just seems very different. The director of an opera is responsible for the staging and the dramaturgy and the acting and all the things a theatre director has to wrangle. But then there is also the music and the singing, which seems quite technical and involves a whole other person doing something that seems very much like directing. Does all that make directing opera very different from all the other kinds of things you've directed?
Well, some sides of opera directing are totally similar to a play, a musical, even a film, in that they all, of course, relate to the basic thing that is a director's job, which is storytelling. It is our job to tell a story and to interpret characters. And in terms of opera, we are doing all of that, as well as, again, like a play or a musical, responsible for the visual. I always say, if people really don't get it, I say it's like everything you see, I am doing, and everything you hear, the conductor and the singers are making those sounds. Now, that's a little simplistic, but for an opera director, you really are responsible for all of that, as well as certain aspects that you don't have in these other things, which are usually large forces of people. You might have a couple hundred people in an opera that would be the chorus, the supernumeraries. On stage, in terms of the backstage, the technical aspects, they're much bigger often than even the biggest musical, because you'll have a large stage crew, dressers, wardrobe, technicians. It's a kind of big thing to wrangle. And it does require, like everything, an enormous amount of planning, but also the ability to be spontaneous.
So you mentioned how, just the scope of opera, all of these roles, from the chorus, the musicians, the supers, dancers, choreographers, all of those things that you mentioned. And because tickets are often expensive, people expect quite spectacular productions. Don't you ever dream of the quote-unquote simplicity of directing, a two-person play in like a black box theater?
Well, I do dream it, and I do get to do that also. But I think there are certainly many cases for much simpler visual worlds of opera, as long as, I think, again, you are drawing in an audience. I mean, sometimes the most simplistic or pared down productions visually might have the strongest physical, mental, oral impact. So I don't think I think it's not always one or the other. I will say often that new opera goers, attracting new people to opera, there are several roads in. And one of them is a large scale production with a couple hundred people on stage, a lot of costume, scenery, etc. And I do
maybe
hear
an animal.
And there's nothing wrong with a horse. I mean, for me, Carmen without a horse just doesn't make it. And for those audiences, that is one road in, the same way, honestly, that sometimes new operas is another road in for certain audiences. But I have found in my position as artistic director, as well as director of this at the Kennedy Center for the Washington National Opera, that I do hear from a lot of new audiences and first-time goers. They love it when it's a big period production. And so we try to give them everything in a season, the pared down and the grand.
I'm surprised to hear that new operas bring in new audiences. I figured that was kind of the opera lovers who were involved in the productions, getting to do that new work but having to do the sort of the classics for the sake of the audience. So it's really, obviously that was an assumption I had made, but it's interesting to hear that that is not actually the case. So new operas bring in new people, huh?
We find that in Washington, D.C., and I have found in other places as well, that certain new operas, particularly ones that might have topical significance or relevance to certain audiences, really draws in new and younger audiences. We also have a program in DC called the American Opera Initiative, where we commission 20-minute operas, a whole series of them. And so telling people, okay, here, you're only going to be there for a while, check it out. And that has been so popular and always sells out. We do that every January. And then our new works that we've done in the last few years, things like Blue by Janine Tesori and Tazewell Thompson, which dealt with racial issues in the United States presently, sold out. We find that certain new operas will sell out. Silent Night, which is a story about World War I, sold out. We are lucky, I will say, in Washington that we have 3 theaters. So we produce in different size theaters, and that is definitely a big help. And maybe I could segue to say that new music was important in approaching Puccini's classic, Turandot.
Yes.
So this opera is Puccini's last opera, and he died before completing it. And there was an ending penned by one of his colleagues, which I personally never found satisfactory as a director. I was always very frustrated by it. So I thought this was a chance to commission new music to an opera that's 100 years old, just for the ending, for the last 20 minutes.
Okay, so I will just also mention that, as you say, it's 100 years now since the premiere, which means that the opera is now in the public domain, right? Is that what allowed you to commission the new ending? And it does just affect the last 20 minutes? I mean, will people still hear Nessun Dorma, the opera's most famous aria, in the sort of usual way?
Absolutely. Everything that Puccini wrote for everything except the last 20 minutes, which he didn't write, is classic Puccini, including the big soccer anthem, Nessun Dorma. And the amazing series of arias like In Questa Reggia that the protagonist sings, the beautiful arias that Liu, the young servant to Timur, sings. So much of the music is familiar. And Puccini was such a great melody creator and character creator through music. But it was really this ending that just had me say, okay, it's time to change it now, as the work began to come into the public domain.
Can you explain what you disliked about the quote-unquote original ending?
I was always very frustrated that Turandot, who, for the sake of the story, poses these 3 riddles to suitors, and if they fail to answer them, they lose their heads. And the character of Calaf answered the 3 riddles successfully, and then he posed a riddle to her, which was to find out his name, which she doesn't successfully answer, but in the end, she realizes the answer is love. And normally at that point in the opera, this realization begins to happen because of a suicide of the character Liu. Mm-hmm. And in true Puccini fashion, normally a Puccini heroine would do something, I think, magnificent or life-changing, or at least certainly in charge of one's own life, whether it be Butterfly, Minnie, Mimi, Musetta. But I felt that what happens in the sort of standard ending is Calaf kisses her and she says, okay, fine, I love you. I roll over here. You can have half the kingdom. And it didn't seem like a Puccini character to me, and it didn't respond to a lot of the unresolved issues in the piece, which I felt was important. So it was with that in mind that I wanted to address this male-female dynamic and also the dynamic of power and who's in charge.
This kind of work of adding a new ending to a piece that's, say, 100 years old, that's very familiar, that's one of the kind of standards of the operatic repertoire. Is this something that has happened before in opera, or is this something that you're pioneering?
Well, actually, other people have penned other endings for this opera.
Oh my.
They did not come into, let's say, a popular realm. And that's why I thought, okay, now I really want to try it and try to attach it to the work and not have to go through a lot of rigmarole and protocol by going back to the publishers.
So how did you go about it?
Well, I knew that I wanted to address the issues in the piece, and there are a lot of issues in the piece aside from this racial stereotyping, this sort of portrayal of particularly the Asian characters often as really not constructive stereotypes. And so those were other things that we wanted to address. But with the ending, as I said, I wanted to address the role of women and the role of what is going to happen to this character, Turandot, what changes her. And I wanted that she changed by understanding the power of love, and that she took on a mantle of grace and humility, and that she becomes the ruler of the country, that her father, the emperor, dies, and that she creates a new kind of democracy. So to go about doing that, I was looking for a composer. First and foremost, I wanted to find, I thought, Asian American composer and librettist, because this has a new libretto, new words. But I wasn't absolutely sure about that. I thought maybe they're Italian, because after all, Puccini's Italian. But then from my son's bedroom came the sounds of classical music one day, which was a shock to me, instead of hearing Sting or Taylor Swift. And it was a game that he was playing. It was one of those Minecraft. And it was the music of, I figured out Christopher Tin, which sounded like classical music. So I Googled him, I read about him. I saw that he was Chinese American living in Los Angeles and a very famous Grammy Award-winning gaming composer. So I reached out to him. This was actually before the pandemic, just to meet him. And I didn't even have this ending in mind yet. Then after the pandemic, when I knew we were going to do it, I went back to him and I said, okay, here is the challenge. I want you to write something melodic in the spirit of Puccini without imitating him, but to use that same colors of orchestra and voices. And so he took up this mantle, and I wanted to find a great writer, playwright. And I went to first a close friend, Chinese American playwright, David Henry Wong. And he recommended this woman, Susan Sun Hee Stanton, to me, who was a playwright, not a sort of solid opera lover the way Christopher Tin was, but someone who certainly liked opera. And I met with her and spoke with her. And at that point, she was immersed in writing the TV show Succession, which is, of course, has power. And that is the story of power.
It sure is. So
we invited her to write a new libretto, which is important. It's not just new music, it's also new words for the ending. So the two of them collaborated with myself, our dramaturg, Kelly Rourke, and came up with a new ending, which we will be opening with in Washington on May 11th. And I hope it becomes more of the standard ending than the one that Franco Alfano has written.
Yes. Well, just to sort of talk a little bit about the nature of the collaboration, was everyone in Los Angeles, was everyone in the same room, in the same city during this sort of collaboration process? How much were they checking in with you? Like, can you give us a picture of what that actually looked like?
Well, as is the case now, most creative meetings happen either on a retreat where you make everybody go somewhere far away together, or on Zoom. And in this case, Susan was working in London, writing, I think, the final series of Succession, because there are a lot of episodes that happen in England in that.
Yes.
Christopher was in LA and I was in New York and DC. But as happens with any new opera, what really begins first is you make a synopsis. You determine what is the story we're going to tell. Then usually, and as was this case, the librettist writes it first. And she writes the words to make sure that we have the words we want to tell. She wrote it in English, although now it's sung in Italian like the rest of the opera. And then Christopher began using themes of Puccini's actual music from Turandot. Some of it references things like Nessun Dorma. Some of it is his music inverted. It's very fascinating to hear the way he approached it. So once there was a libretto, which would be probably a little bit more than a year ago, Christopher then set about writing it. And then, like we do with all new operas in our world, we do a workshop where we sing through it, not with the real singers, but in this case with our wonderful group of young artists who are part of the WNO. And so they sang through it, and then we can hear it, and then everybody makes comments, and you make changes and edits, it's the same process for any other opera or play or musical. And then once they did that, then Christopher continues writing. This is just the piano vocal score, because for a composer, they're writing first the piano vocal score, and then they go back and orchestrate it, which in this case is monumental. There's 70 players in the orchestra. So that's the process for a new opera. In this case, it's only 20 minutes of music, but it still takes time because you've really got to, it just takes time to delve into everything.
We'll be right back with more of June's conversation with Francesca Zambello.
Introducing Wondersuite from Bluehost.com, the tool that makes WordPress wonderful for everyone. Website creation is hard, but now with Bluehost, you can answer a few simple questions about your business and goals, and the Wondersuite tools will automatically lay out your WordPress website or store in minutes. Seriously. From there, you can customize your design, pick your brand colors, and add blocks. No custom theme or coding required. You'll get content suggestions that you can keep or revise, and with Yoast SEO built in, we automatically help you get found in search engines. From step-by-step guidance to suggested plugins to an AI-powered help bot, our built-in tools make WordPress wonderful for everyone. Whether you're a beginner or a pro, you can join over 2 million Bluehost users. Go to bluehost.com/wondersuite. That's bluehost.com/wondersuite.
In 1978, gay people in California faced a dire threat.
Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative.
The teaching profession is riddled with the homosexual element.
John Briggs is going to fire every gay and lesbian school teacher in the state of California.
I'm Christina Cauterucci. This season on Slow Burn, we'll explore how a nationwide backlash against gays and lesbians led to a massive showdown in California.
This was tens of thousands of pissed off gay guys and lesbians roaring down Market Street.
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We've got to fight back. We can't let this happen in California.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Out now, wherever you listen.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. Every other Thursday on Working Overtime, we offer advice on how to get creative work done. So please tell us your challenges and let us help you. Drop us a line at working@slate.com. You can also send a voice memo to that address or give us a ring at 304-933-WORK. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Working wherever you get your podcasts. Now, let's return to June's conversation with Francesca Zambello.
One of the things that I am conscious of is that opera singers, learn roles. Do the new 20 minutes mean that effectively that an opera singer who has Turandot in their repertoire now won't have this Turandot in their repertoire? Will it mean kind of relearning And what's the response to that from singers?
Well, in this case, we have two Turandots and two Kalafs who this affects them the most. It's also new chorus music, new music for the characters, the three ministers who Puccini did call them Ping, Pang, and Pong, and we have taken out those names because they feel very bad stereotyping. And so we are referring to them by their other names as the three ministers. So they all sing plus the chorus. So all of both casts, both Turandots and both Kalafs, were totally thrilled and excited to do this and have learned all the new music and also worked with Christopher if there was something that didn't work for them vocally in their passaggio or, whatever, which is the great thing about having a living composer. Is that you can go to them and say, maybe could I try blah, blah, blah. And also, of course, a wonderful collaboration with our maestra, Speranza Scapucci, who is conducting. And so in the case of Puccini uses so much as, not to go into all the Italian terms, but stretching and shrinking, slowing down and speeding up, and louder and softer. And that really, the conductor puts that in with the score. The score is a roadmap and they interpret it. And so in this case, the singers and Speranza have been interpreting it and have had to learn all that new music, and they're totally happy about it. I mean, it's not the easiest thing, of course, especially because some of them have sung these roles before. Yeah. But in the case of both casts, Young-Sun Lee, Ava Planka, Marjorie Owens, and Jonathan Burton, they have all learned the new ending and are excited about it. And because they're excited not just that it's new, but it also, particularly for the women, they keep saying, oh, now I feel like my character has a great resolution.
It must be tricky, though, because, it would be great if this became the standard ending. But I imagine, Eva Planka may have to go off to another house and do the other Turandot this season or something.
Well, we'll see. I mean, of course, this is standard. Verdi wrote his opera Don Carlos. He wrote it in French and Italian. And singers often have to learn both versions depending on who's doing it. So it's not like this is a total anomaly having to learn this. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes down. And listen, like all new works, there are going to be people who love it, and there are going to be people who say, I can't stand it.
Amazing. So the changes did kind of affect the rehearsal process because this was effectively learning new material, but obviously every production is a little bit different. I mean, were you aware of this seeming like a very different rehearsal process?
Well, I think there was a level of excitement. We're in it right now. We're rehearsing right now. So people are excited by doing the new ending and by the process of working on a new ending. I just came from a rehearsal of it yesterday. And I think it especially someone like Ava, who has sung this role a lot, as well as our Kalafs, they're excited to be doing something new. And I think all of us are always excited by the prospects of the unknown.
So were you also sort of consciously, in addition to this new ending, and you've talked about some of the other changes that you have made to kind of address some stereotypes and so on, but were you also wanting this staging, this production to look different, to be, to seem different in other ways, in all kinds of ways?
Right. Well, I think we have to remember that this story has a long gestation. It's a story that has its roots in, first of all, Commedia dell'arte. It was a play first, Italian play. Then it was based on a Persian legend. Then Turandot was taken up by Puccini. So it's had cultural references from Italy, France, Persia, and China. And of course, the story is situated supposedly in Beijing, but Beijing was a crossroads all through the Middle Ages. But I went to a team of American designers with Asian backgrounds, Wilson Chin for the sets, Linda Cho for the costumes, S. Katie Tucker projections, Amath Chandapur for lighting, and Jessica and Kanji Sagawa for choreography. And I wanted all of them to bring Asian and American and Italian influences to the piece. So the setting is something that is reminiscent of, and because the story is this, of a totalitarian government. And what we see is all these different races have come to Beijing following their leader, their princes, to try their hand at the riddles. So we have a collection of refugees who have ended up being stuck there because their princes all lost their heads. And so it is reminiscent of what we see a lot in the world now, a lot of refugee areas, industrial areas, but also there is definitely an Asian influence. There is a suggestion when you think about China, North Korea, places that have governments that are restrictive. So we used a lot of that for the visual inspiration. Also, it's a terrible bloody opera. There's an executioner who's walking around from the first 3 minutes of the piece chopping off heads. So we wanted to make sure that we got all of that in. And that's all of those elements are part of the visual landscape of the piece.
Wow. I am very conscious that you are based at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., America's seat of power. I know that being in D.C. has shaped your interpretation, for example, of Wagner's Ring Cycle, which is also a story about power. Obviously, as you've just described, that at the very center of Turandot are these themes of power and ruling. But still, you're in D.C. Have you done this opera anywhere else, and did it seem different to you here in regards to power?
I mean, I have done, honestly, 2 other big productions of this opera. One was at the Paris Opera, and then the other was at the Bolshoi. And they were both very different designers. But I was grappling with a lot of the issues that I feel now with our team that we've tried to resolve and address. Of course, in Washington, people think about power and the misuse of power all the time. And I think that that is a current that runs certainly underneath this piece. But also what I've really tried to do is address the history of the character of Turandot. Her famous aria in Questa Regia is very much about her ancestress, Lu Ling, who was raped. And it's not like I'm inventing that story. That's what she tells in that aria. And we always seem to just gloss over that. And in a way, I think that sense of survivorship dominates her behavior, and that's what has to change within her. So there's a question of female power, but also the power of her father, the emperor, who has put out this decree that it must be that someone answers these 3 riddles to win her hand. So I think you always have these subliminal notions of power underneath an opera like this. But of course, in Washington, I do think people think about it more. I don't think I necessarily have to underline it. I think people come in every day from being obsessed about seeing what's happening today in the Supreme Court or in the Senate. And clearly, we're in a time of amazing malcontent, and democracy is on trial. Yeah. And so I think whatever side you're on, and it's not my job working at the Kennedy Center to say which side to be on, but I can certainly portray the different sides in this kind of piece.
Yeah. You've been directing opera for 4 decades. This is an art form that has existed for centuries. Still, has the American opera changed in that period? Has your approach to directing opera changed over that period?
I think directing, of course, has come much more to prominence. I feel very fortunate to have directed around the world, and I'm very grateful to a lot of overseas companies because a lot of my first jobs were there. It was a lot easier for a woman to get jobs abroad in the 80s and even into the 90s in theaters in Europe and in Asia than it was in the United States. So, of course, it's changed. But I do think in the end, in America, and I feel very committed now to doing opera in America, I want to reflect our culture, whether it be through the works that I commission from emerging composers and librettists, or how we interpret pieces, how the teams that we put together to hire them. I try to reflect what I think is going to make an audience think, but also be entertained. I mean, we are a service organization. Let's not get away from that. We are there to attract an audience and to make them happy and make them want to come back. And I do think about that a lot.
So, Francesca, you mentioned that there were more opportunities for a woman to get into production of opera in Europe. Can you talk about what was different in Europe and Asia in the 80s and 90s?
For me, I grew up in Europe. And so when I realized I wanted to pursue more of a career in opera and working in production and directing in opera, I went to Europe because there were more jobs and I was more likely to get a job as a woman. There were not a lot of, let's say, role models of female stage directors or producers in America. I mean, barely any, but in Europe I saw more and I saw more opportunities. There are much more theaters, of course, in Europe at that time. And so during the 80s, I directed a lot in Germany and Italy and France and England. I was very fortunate to be employed by a lot of companies and to really get amazing experiences. It also helped that having grown up in Europe, I speak a number of languages, so I was able to get right into certain theaters and not have a language barrier. And then it was really much more in the late 90s and aughts that I started working full tilt in America as well. And by then I thought, I want to come back to America. I want to give back to a lot of my colleagues and to younger people coming up in the profession.
And would you say that it has changed in America now?
Oh, well, I see so much more gender equality, racial equality across the boards. And it's something I personally have worked for in both companies where I've had leadership roles, because it does have to come from the leader. I mean, we can talk about it till we're blue in the face, but it's not often until there might be a person of color or a woman in charge that there's, I think, going to really push on this aspect. Of course, many of my colleagues do as well, but it's been very important to me, and it's been an integral part of my programming and planning at the Washington National Opera.
Francesca Zambello, it's been a great honor to talk with you and to learn more about the new Turandot. Thank you for joining us on Working.
Been a pleasure to talk with you all. Thank you for having me.
Up next, June and I will dive deeper into revisions and changes to established and known and even classic works. Stick around for that. June Thomas, what an interesting conversation.
Ronald Young Jr., thank you for saying so.
Oh, of course. I'm no stranger to adaptations, and I know things can change with public sensibilities, but it was fascinating to hear Francesca talk about the changes she wanted to make to Turandot due to her dislike of what happened with the characters towards the end, and as a measure to amend the racial stereotypes of Asian folks presented in the piece. I'm wondering if we could speculate a bit about how the authors of pieces that receive this type of treatment or even criticism would respond, knowing that we're making these types of updates to their work in the future.
Well, you know, as Francesca said, there were a couple of very specific features that made this possible, both legally and in terms of the way people, even traditionalists who don't like any changes, were likely to respond. Puccini died before he finished the opera, so everyone has always known that the ending wasn't his work. And importantly, it just entered the public domain this year. So there was no, wrangling with licenses and all that sort of thing. I do think it's reasonable to be wary of changing an artist's work, at least in its original form. That definitely raises the specter of meddling. However, one of the things that comes to my mind is that there are certain properties that get reworked over and over again. In Britain, for example, many of the novels and short stories of Agatha Christie have been adapted for television literally 4 times in the last 40 years. Each version emphasizes something different so that you can watch a story that you saw a few weeks before and not even recognize it for the first hour or so. That kind of framing and interpretation feels totally reasonable to me. Bring different things to the fore. That's just interesting. And I don't feel that sense of meddling in when it's that kind of reworking.
I agree. I think there's got to be some leeway in terms of making revisions like this. I think the time that I don't mean to sound like preserve history. I'm not one of those people. I definitely think we should teach history and we should tell people what's going on. And there's some works that reflect the time period they're in. And I don't want to adapt too many things to like our own sensibilities today. Otherwise, we forget about the time periods that we used to be in and we risk losing that knowledge. But there is an opportunity if you're saying like we're going to the opera to enjoy a play, especially in a case like this where the ending was not written. Like, why not make some changes that make everybody feel like a little bit better about going to see that opera, you know?
Yeah, totally.
And when it comes to issues of race, I thought it was admirable that Francesca was seeking out an Asian American composer and librettist. Why do you think it's important to make these types of intentionally specific decisions when making updates to work like this in the present?
Well, let me just remind people about the certain kind of skit. Many of us have probably seen these short films where let me be more specific, a white person, usually a white man, he comes on and he talks about how excited he is to show one of his favorite films from his teenage years to his girlfriend who's never seen it. And finally, he's going to have a chance to share this beloved work from his youth. And it starts and he's super excited. And then so very soon, he realizes, oh my God, it's full of like really racist stereotypes and totally gross sexual manipulation. And, I know exactly what that guy's talking about. But you know what? Women have always known that the gender stuff was creepy. And people of color did not need a fourth or fifth screening to notice all the racist tropes, I am pretty sure. So, Turandot is a white person's version of a mostly Asian, a little bit Middle Eastern story. So who better to update it than Asian American artists? And I have to say, judging from the reviews, which have been very positive, they have been extraordinarily successful. And, I think it is worth underlining that Francesca Zambello has a great record of transforming the companies she works with and of commissioning new work that centers on communities of color. And the fact is, when women, queer people, people of color are in leadership positions, they are just much more likely to prioritize change and then work to make sure it happens. It's not an intellectual exercise for them, and she's an example of that.
I absolutely agree with that. I think I always think about the movie Black Panther, where they kind of got it right from the beginning by the intentionally choosing the creators they chose to tell that story. And as a result, it became like a beloved film, both in the Marvel canon and in the Black community. And I think giving folks that type of opportunity to make that type of work and define that type of broad, wide-reaching work that does have some sort of, racial angle, or at least some sort of racial lens to tell a story. I think it's important to allow everyone to be involved in that conversation when it comes to making that work. So I love that she did that. I love your answer.
Right on.
I also love the discussion y'all had about proximity to DC and discussions of power in art. It immediately made me think that here in DC, even seeing something like Hamilton, the musical, can be political when we start to consider the ways that politics worked back then and what writing a musical about that actually is saying about politics today. So talk to me more about the importance of location when it comes to performing or setting a piece of art.
Well, I've never seen a classical Greek tragedy played in the open air, much less, anywhere that was part of the ancient Greek Empire. But I imagine that would be pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Seeing plays in the open air, Shakespeare in the Park, for example, it's always special. The darkening sky becomes part of the experience. Or I've definitely been there where a rainstorm adds to the sense of peril that's playing out on the stage.
I love that.
I have to say, though, location can sometimes have a negative effect. I once saw a production of West Side Story, the best musical ever written, in Madrid. And it was in English, of course. And it seemed that there were a lot of people in the audience who didn't speak English at least well enough to kind of follow what was going on, and perfectly reasonable. But every time someone spoke Spanish, which, of course, the Sharks sometimes do, they're Puerto Rican, a lot of the audience would laugh nervously. And I just need to say that totally spoiled a big tragic death scene. Nervous titters were not appropriate. They did not enhance the experience then. I have to say, though, I know you're a DC guy, and I'm not. I'm not a DC person, so I hate to admit it, but there are certain cities where works that are heavily focused on power, they just hit harder. DC is definitely one of those cities, and Moscow, where Francesca has spent a lot of time working over the course of her career, is another for sure.
Ooh, I bet that would be. That's very interesting. June, you seem well versed in opera. Tell me your favorite opera, and give me, a newbie who has never seen an opera, where do I start?
Well, I lived for 15 years in Seattle, where the opera company is known for its productions of Wagner, especially Wagner's Ring Cycle. I have seen, I think, 3 full versions of The Ring, which, of course, is 4 operas performed over the course of a week, about 15 hours of music total. It's a commitment. Gotterdammerung, the last part of the cycle, it's about 5 hours, but usually there's a meal break. So it's basically, a full day's work going to see the opera. Is absolutely amazing. There truly is nothing better than a good production of The Ring. But it's definitely not it's not a place to begin. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's not a beginner's work. Francesca mentioned the ABCs, Aida, La Bohème, and Carmen. They're all popular for a reason. But my pick would be Orfeo ed Euridice by Gluck. It's a very romantic story. It's a story of Orpheus, who loves his late wife so much, he follows her into the underworld. There are some great arias, lovely music. Orfeo is usually a trouser role, that is, he's played by a woman, a mezzo-soprano, but the Metropolitan Opera is currently staging a production where Orfeo is played by a countertenor, a male singer with a very high voice. Best of all, though, it's pretty short, little over an hour and a half. Perfect.
Now, is that what Hadestown is based on?
Yes, funnily enough, it took me a minute to figure that out. But yeah, it's the same story, exactly.
Okay, I think I might check that out. I was not a huge fan of Hadestown, but I know that original Greek myth is something that was interesting to me. So I think you might have got me. So good job, June.
Hey, thank you.
That's about all the time we have for this week. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Then you'll never miss an episode. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Slow Burn, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus.
Thank you so much to Francesca Zambello for joining us this week, and of course to our wonderful producer, Cameron Drews. We'll be back next week with Isaac Butler's conversation with choreographer Justin Peck. Until then, get back to work.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.